off we go. Feel free to throw out questions in the chat. Faye's in the wings, kind of tracking some of that stuff and writing those down. Even if we don't hit them today, sometimes we save them, keep them for next episodes or shows where they're a little bit more key or whatever. So please feel free. All right, here we go. We have started recording on all fronts. Looks like technically we're ready, and let me make sure this is the right tab. Okay, here we go. In 3, 2, 1.
Fantastic Pixel Castle and Frog Pants Studios presents Word on the Street with Greg Street and Scott Johnson.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Word on the Street. As mentioned in that little voiceover, I am Scott Johnson, and I am here with Greg Street after what feels like too long. We had to delay this month's episode a little bit because you guys were super busy. Greg, do you want to mention anything about that? Like, what were you guys up to? What sneaky little thing you were doing?
We had a couple things going on. First off, hi, glad to be back. It has been too long.
Yeah.
We had a big milestone that we were wrapping up, and we try to end milestone with like a play test and a really stable build. And then because we're a remote studio, we periodically get together in person for offsites because we just think it's super valuable for communication. And like I just told the team, it's hard to think that so-and-so was a jerk when you've, gone out and had a beer with them and that kind of thing.
Right.
So if you disagree about game design later on, you can think back to like, oh, but we had that offsite. So we just did that as well. We just got back last weekend.
Wow. That sounds like a blast. That's an interesting thing to do. I guess it makes sense. You guys are, almost 100% a remote studio, and
yeah.
You need to create, like, that's interesting. I don't know. Maybe other industries can learn from this. Everybody who's either concerned about a remote situation, you do this once in a while, and you get that camaraderie, you get that chance to be near each other and understand each other and that sort of thing. But what happens if they didn't like each other in the Teams discussion they had, and then they go out on the thing and now they really don't like each other because
hasn't happened yet. I mean,
Okay.
it's not mandatory that you're like best friends with the people you work with, but because we all kind of assembled around this shared vision for the game and shared values for the studio, at least you have something in common with them.
Good point. Well, that's awesome. We have one of those fine folks with us today. I would like to introduce the director of UX over at Fantastic Pixel Castle. It is Ed Altorfer. Did I get it right?
Got it.
I did.
Nailed it.
Oh my gosh.
I still hate Greg though, so I don't know. If
That didn't solve that issue for you at this.
It didn't work.
That's a shame.
We'll do more offsites. We'll try to fix it.
Okay. All right. Let's do enough.
Well, it's good to have you here. I'm infinitely interested in this aspect of video games because it is really, truly, you're the handshake part of this, right? You're the part where the player comes to the game and says,
Yeah.
how are you and I going to interface? How are we going to get along? And there are a lot of big questions to answer in that regard. And I played plenty of games where the gameplay and the game itself is amazing, but my on-ramp or my UI or my combination of those things is bad. And it is not a great experience. And so you have some pressure on you. Do you feel that pressure building this MMO?
Well, first, I actually might steal the analogy you just used of the handshake because I think it's a really good one, right? Like the user experience design often is kind of that glue between, okay, what is the player coming to the game to do and how do they figure out what the game wants from them, right? So I love that analogy. I guess in a way, yes, whenever I'm working on something, especially because right now I'm the only UX person on our entire team. So like there is a little bit of pressure of like, well, if that thing sucks, it's probably me. So I guess there is some pressure there, but no, honestly, like I love this stuff. I've played MMOs since I was 9 years old or something. So I have, predictably lots of opinions about, what the UX should be, what the UI should be, how the controls should work. It'll definitely be challenging to make a great game, but I think it's more excitement and a little bit of nervous than a lot of pressure.
Sure. Yeah. And it sounds like, you've got, well, I know you do. You have a team that is, perfectly suited for smaller, one guy department for now. type arrangements where, you don't have to necessarily knock the world over or set it on fire. You just have to, work with these goofballs. I mean, Greg, and from your perspective as studio head and game head, how important is his role? How important is the role of UX in the game?
It's not important.
Not at all.
Not important. This is actually where I get fired.
Live on podcast. I think a mistake that developers make sometime is they think that UX is like this frosting that you put on the cake once you bake the cake, and then you like make it all pretty at the end. But it really infiltrates the gameplay all over the place. Like simple decisions like, how many abilities do we have in the game? How many bag spaces are there? And that's pretty tactical stuff. But if you don't think about it up front, you spend a lot of time kind of shoehorning stuff in later. So that was a big part of it, honestly, too. I had worked with Ed at Riot on a couple of different games, and I just knew his approach and mentality to kind of life as a startup would just be perfect for helping us to get started. So I was really, he was the first person I hired once I started the studio.
Oh, wow. First hire. I didn't know that.
I was like, hire me.
We should have made
that was Ed and I in meetings like, what should we do?
We should have made a huge deal out of that. I had no idea. We haven't had a first hire on yet, so this is fantastic. So Ed, let me ask you this, Ed. This is interesting because knowing that you come from Riot and you guys work together over there, this is obviously a bit of a different animal. I don't know if you were working on the proposed MMO over there or not under Greg. Was that okay? You were. So did a lot of that experience there? I assume you can take ideas and tools and concepts and stuff that maybe you brought to the table there, you can bring to bear here as well. Not to say I'm taking a bunch of Riot ideas and using them on our game. That's not really what I mean. But that experience must have been valuable in your job.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because whenever you're doing design, it's a mix of your personal experiences playing games and the needs of the specific game and what the vision of the game is, and the team and what the team is saying, what kind of feedback the team is giving. So you typically, from game to game, you end up with kind of a common through line of like, this is my style of design, but you don't often end up with like, oh yeah, I just did the same solution over and over in each game that I worked on. So that doesn't really happen. But I think you're right that, having made a party UI, for example, at Riot in the League MMO, like it does sort of just inform what are the kinds of things you're thinking about, what are the edge cases that maybe you sort of realize when you're working on it the first time that, now that you're doing it again, you're sort of more aware of it. So I'd say it sort of increases your field of view in a way, having worked on similar problems before, so that you can maybe solve them faster the next time you see them. It doesn't really result in the same solutions necessarily. I guess in some cases maybe it's similar, but
Sure. Well, I guess any experience comes to bear when you're working on a project like this. This leads us to an interesting question we got on Twitter /X from somebody named Machinga MMO. Seems like that guy likes MMOs. If you put your MMO in your name,
you would think,
yeah, it kind of acknowledges your love of the medium. But here's what he says. I want a real honest dev discussion on things like DPS meters, combat replays, performance or learning tools, etc. They're common pieces of player UI, but always third party. Even acknowledging they exist can get you in trouble in some MMOs. It's absurd, he says. I feel like this mirrors a lot of thinking outside or in the gaming community or in the MMO community regarding some of these issues. DPS meters is a big one.
Yeah, it is.
So let's get down to the dirt there. What is the at least at this stage? We're obviously very early, very prototype, but at this stage, what are some of your sort of, I guess, key philosophies moving forward on things like DPS meters?
Yeah, this is so interesting because we've debated this within the team, kind of jokingly, but also kind of not jokingly. There are very strong opinions, like even within the dev team, about like DPS meters, and I can talk a little bit about like why does that happen, right? And I think it's from the different perspectives that we have. Like as a dev team, we have one perspective, which is we want players to come play our game, have a fun time with their friends, have the tools they need to understand if they're able to do the content, kill the boss in the raid or whatever. But we don't want to create situations in our game where players are gonna, I don't know, bully each other or overly optimize towards something that isn't fun for a lot of people or things like that. And on the other hand, players are like, well, I want to see how much am I hurting the boss, right? How much am I like, am I doing better than that other guy that I have a friendly rivalry with, or not so friendly rivalry, right? And so there is this kind of like clash of perspectives, I think, where players will often hyper optimize things, and therefore DPS meters and logs and things like that are really useful. But from a dev perspective, we don't always want that, because it can create these kind of weird perverse incentives for players to kind of treat each other maybe less than great. And so I think the problem space is, how do you marry those two things, right? How do you, because I help run a raid in WoW Classic, so I kind of get both sides of this perspective. Often as a raid leader, like, I kind of want to be able to pull up the log and be like, what happened? What caused that wipe that we just had, right? Or like, who's struggling? Who kind of maybe is having a harder time understanding how to do optimal DPS on the class they're playing, or things like that. And so I think the problem for us is to try to figure out, how do we give players the right tools that do help them understand how they can get better at the game, how they can kill the boss better, what they're maybe doing wrong, but not create an environment where it feels mandatory to sort of hyper optimize. And if I'm not playing my class 99.9% correctly, I'm going to get kicked out of the raid or not invited or whatever. So I think that's the challenge, is trying to balance those things. I'm a huge proponent of tools like this, but I think the execution matters. I think the way that you do a DPS meter, for example, even down to decisions like, should it be available to you only? Like, is it only you who should be able to see your DPS, or maybe you and the raid leader? Like, are there different combinations of things that make sense than just it's posted up on a leaderboard for everyone to see? Like, I'm not sure. And we haven't thought super deeply about it, but that's kind of the things I'm thinking about.
So, Greg, let me toss an additional thought to you as someone who's, overseeing the overall design of this thing. It is a bit of a dichotomy for players who want challenging content, challenging group content in particular. And we'll use WoW as an example, and also as a contrast, we'll use, say, Final Fantasy XIV as a different approach, at least from the top down, about how they view, say, DPS meters and that sort of thing. They don't want you to have those. In fact, it's a break of terms of service on the Final Fantasy side if you use some sort of third-party mod that does just that. I believe that's still the case, and I could be wrong. Someone may correct me on this.
A bit don't ask, don't tell. Yeah.
Kind of one of those deals. But it feels like they actively want people not to have these incentives to be mad at each other. But at the same time, I think Ed said it really well. When you're running a raid and you're doing it on the regular, and you're all trying to be very competitive, you may not be trying for world first, but you're trying to play well. These are helpful numbers. So from just the bird's eye view of this, which maybe this is hard to do until you guys get going and have that out there. I don't know. But that kind of group content, how important is it to make these decisions early so that when that stuff comes around, you're not creating animosity or giving players not enough reason to be competitive in their play, if any of that makes sense.
No, it all makes sense. And it's something we had to talk about really early on, because like with a lot of UX, if we don't talk about it now, we're going to kind of stumble into it in a non-deliberate way. We're just going to end up with like, oh, I guess this is our game now. So we try to be really deliberate about it. An aspect you didn't mention is even in like competitive raiding, there's a point at which you're struggling to beat the boss. And then there's a point at which stuff's on farm, even if it's the earlier bosses. And what players will say then is, well, my first enemy is the boss. My second enemy is like the other DPS players. And I want to, I'm competing against them. And that's entertaining for them. And it's entertaining for people to get better. So I'll be honest, my initial approach was no third-party mods. And I said that because when I was on WoW, I was the guy who had to like deal with that arms race. And like every day, Tom Thompson and the UI team would come to me and say, hey, players invented this other mod. Are we going to allow it or not? And the answer was always like, oh God, I don't know. Like,
not again.
Is it crossing the line? Is it giving them too much information? Are they going to use it to like draw obscene things on the screen? And that aspect I hate, and I don't want us to be in that situation where players come up with something clever and do all this hard work to make a mod, and then we immediately ban it. So I'd much rather approach it philosophically with players of this is what we think is fair and this is what we think is not fair. For example, one of the things Ed told me that convinced me that the approach of no third-party mods was wrong was the question of accessibility. And particularly not just talking about making the game easy to play, but for people who have some sort of color blindness or can't see, can't hear as well, and things like that. It would be hard for a small studio to add every one of those options, although we'll definitely add some. But when you let players do it, they can add almost anything as a mod. They're like, oh, we know there's a very small component of players who have this particular issue. We'll make a third-party mod that helps them with this issue. Right. And now all of a sudden you're empowering your community instead of like fighting against them.
Right.
Yeah. I'll pause there because I know that was a lot of info.
No, it's good. I guess the question from there would be, a lot of times what would happen, at least in WoW's case, I would notice over the years, is sometimes a third-party mod would be so well received by the community and so universally used that it was only a matter of time before an expansion introduced it as part of the default UI. And that would happen. And then now you have this whole other animal of Blizzard's just letting their users make stuff for them, and then they just integrate it. That's lame. And the third-party people get nothing for their hard work, and it just kills their mod, and this sort of thing. How open do you want to make the architecture? And I guess Ed, I would ask you how much key do you want to give them to run the car once this thing's released?
That's a great question. I've thought about that example that you just gave of like, oh, third-party developer makes a really cool thing, and then we're like, gosh, maybe that should just be part of the game. I think, I'm not sure, but I think maybe there could be other approaches there than we're going to go build our own version of that thing and essentially obsolete the thing the community made. Like I kind of stay up at night a little bit wondering about whether there are partnership models that maybe could make sense there, where it's like, how do we kind of recognize and empower the third party developer for making something really cool? Like, is there a world where we could make that easier for players to get and put in their game without necessarily going and building that ourselves? Like, is there some kind of happy medium there? Because I agree, and like, as someone who does a lot of hobby projects, it can feel really bad if you put a lot of hours into a hobby project and the developer's just like, yoink, like, thank you for the great idea. So I think finding a balance there makes sense. In terms of the amount of power that we would maybe want to give a third-party developer, I hesitate to say because I don't know exactly, but I guess I can talk about my mental framework of how I think we should approach that, which is, I think a lot of games start with, oh, you can kind of do anything. And then they try to pull back from that when they realize that there are edge cases that are not great, right? Oh, users made an add-on that tells players exactly where to go at the time that this boss mechanic happens, and then they just follow it and they don't actually do the mechanic and they don't play the fight correctly. I think things like that are not great. We definitely would not want to enable third-party UI modification that effectively allows people to develop things that tell you exactly how to do a raid encounter. I think that's actually kind of the fail state that I look at. But we do want to allow people to customize their UI or solve for accessibility concerns or put information on screen that is valuable to them that isn't sort of crossing that line. So I think we would probably want to start from a place where we enabled relatively few things that we felt really good about, and then expand that over time in an experimental way so that we could kind of keep an eye on where there were sort of situations where developers were making things that we kind of felt weren't in the best interest of the game long term. And by that, what I mean is that they either harm the sort of long-term enjoyment of players, or they create an expectation that something is mandatory, that all players must install an add-on, or that they create a weird dynamic between us and the player ecosystem, where we're kind of constantly forced to make raid mechanics harder and harder and harder because developers are making add-ons that automate more and more and more of the raid experience. So I think those are kind of the things that we want to watch out for, and just kind of start limited and then expand out from there.
That makes sense to me. We got a question in the chat from... Scott, oh, go ahead, please.
Something else that you talked about a little bit when Halinka was on is part of the reason DPS meters work so well in games like World of Warcraft is it's a DPS game, right? Like the way you overcome almost any obstacle is
Do more
you
damage.
damage fast enough before the boss enrages or something.
Yeah.
We call that, not always nicely, but we all worked on the game and love it. Stand and deliver, where you stand up in front of the boss and you hit it with your sword, and how well you can execute your rotation. Whatever the boss is doing is almost irrelevant to you, like mastering that rotation. So we want our combat to take a little bit more of that out, where it's more of a puzzle to solve and less about, are you pushing the buttons in the right order? And in that world, we think DPS will matter less than, and it'll still matter, but it'll matter less than, could you work together to defeat the boss?
I see. So, because that's a really good point. Because right now, that onus is true. It really is on the DPS for these fights to go the way you need them to. You do need your tank swaps to happen when they happen. You need your healers to do what your healers need to do. You need to do the weird mechanics in the game or in the fight. But you have to have enough damage to take the thing down, like you said, before it enrages, or whatever the mechanic is that means you didn't do enough.
Softer heart enrage.
Yeah, the idea that you might take a little longer, but you coordinated better, and it was less dependent on everybody being perfectly geared and rotating properly, that's still good and will still help you, but it's not the key thing. The key thing is that everybody worked as a team in these other ways. That's really compelling. Like that's probably a hard target to hit, I'm guessing, because if this was easy, everybody would do it. It's hard, but on the other hand, we have a lot of veterans from places like World of Warcraft and also Guild Wars and other studios. So we kind of learned, it's hard to undo it once the game has been that way for years. But so starting where we are, for example, something else we may want to talk about a little bit with Ed here is we want a lot less of the combat game in Ghost to be about watching buff and debuff icons. Yeah. Where for World of Warcraft, I mean, honestly, that's almost everything. Is your buff correctly applied? Yeah. Is this debuff correctly applied? That sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's even a question on Twitter from Real James Jed who says people shit on weak auras a bunch in WoW and say it ruins the game. But honestly, I would love nothing more to have a built-in UI that functions in a similar way. I'm curious to hear how much you guys think is too much info when it comes to stuff like weak auras. But I think we can apply this to almost any indicator of things happening during the battle. Stuff as simple as this is currently my buffs above my head and my debuffs to more complex stuff than that. I guess you'll know more as the game goes on, but is there already an early feeling, Ed, of like how much is too much, and you don't want, and you're already feeling like maybe you want to have less or more? Like where's your head at on that?
Yeah, I think in terms of, there's a difference for me between what is the kind of the core base experience that allows a player to play the game successfully, and what are the variations on that certain players in certain roles or with certain preferences want, right? And I think I've kind of pitched this idea called focuses in our game, where you can have maybe different kind of UI layouts that are more or less saved, and you can kind of swap between them. So examples of this might be, well, do I have a UI layout that I use when I'm in town versus when I'm in a raid? Or do I have a UI layout that I use when I'm playing this class versus the rat catcher or whatever? And I think we can get a lot of mileage out of that. We can design a really tight core experience that isn't super overwhelming, that doesn't have tons of information on screen, but allows you to play the game and enjoy it and enjoy the world. But I think there is a place for allowing a lot of that customization, and it's less about having too much information, because look, some players, me included, as a UX designer, just love a lot of information on screen, right? When I'm raiding, I have lots of, I have all of our raids major cooldowns on the side of my screen, and I have information about the tanks, and I have, a full all the raid frames and all of our people in the raid, and I have who has a soul stone active and is dead, and all this kind of stuff, right? But that doesn't matter for everyone. That's my preference, or that's what I need as a raid leader. And so I think acknowledging there's that distinction is important. And so I would say it's less about, I love weak auras because they allow players to develop ways of their UI working better for them. An example of that might be, I'll give you an example. Like, we were recently progging a boss. That boss puts a debuff on the tanks that reduces healing, but I was having a hard time watching it as I was trying to get the boss in position and all this kind of stuff. So I made a weak aura that just when one of the stacks got applied to me for the first time, the weak aura would just say text to speech, debuff stack or whatever, so that I could hear that and go, okay, I don't even need to look at the UI. I know that this thing just got applied to me, and I can call it out and I can do accordingly. And we were able to kind of prog the boss after that.
Right.
So I think like that's a good example of how weak auras can be awesome and flexible. A bad example is if you can develop a weak aura that's like, hey, this mechanic is happening that requires the raid to spread, and you need to move 2 more yards to the left to get out of that mechanic, right? At the point where you can do that, you could just develop a text-to-speech thing that says, move 2 yards left, and you don't even really have to know what the fight mechanic is at that point, right? So I think it's more about controlling sort of what information does the UI do mods and things like that have access to, right? What are the things that you can present on screen more so than what are the number of things you could put on screen if you wanted to, if that makes sense.
Sure, absolutely. Greg, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, weak auras exist because players are saying they need something to hit them in the head a little bit more of like this debuff is on cooldown or a proc just happened that I didn't notice. So it's easy for us to say, oh, we'll just make it more noticeable. But I think it is about unpacking what is combat in a philosophical sense. And is it about managing lots of little bitty icons, getting up all of your 5 dots before you can start doing damage? Or is it more about looking at cues of what the boss is doing and saying like, well, now the boss is got its back turned, so I want to use a different ability now.
Yeah. Interesting. So we've got this question that is one that maybe needs a little more context, but I'm going to read it anyway. The future of MMO the future of MMO UX design and how current design is also a major stopping point for many new players coming into the genre. This is from Oh Hey Spun on X/Twitter. That's an interesting one because I don't know, like if I was to launch a new MMO to, I literally on my desktop, I mean, not launch my own, but launch a game that I haven't played yet. I would expect some stuff to be there. I expect some sort of, whether it's something like WoW or something like ESO where they simplify it a bit, it's a little more real-time action and less tab targeting or whatever. I would expect the keys 1 through 5 and perhaps beyond would be assignable, and that it would let me assign different things to right click, regular click, this sort of thing. Like the standards always are there, and I expect them. I've never really thought about them as being stopping points for new players. And so I'm not entirely sure what he means, but I'm wondering if that maybe rings any bells for you guys. Ed, we'll start with you. Do you feel like there's a current, lack of player experience, since this is your focus there, that is stopping new players from entering the genre? And it only caters to us old guys who've been playing MMOs since, EverQuest 1 or whatever.
I think a little bit, yeah. Like when I think about, I have this distinct memory of someone who used to play a bunch of WoW, and I kind of was trying to get them back into it even. So they had played it before, but I remember them reinstalling it and logging in and going, oh God, wait. I need to set up my UI, right? Like, it's like, and this was this, you can see the soul draining out of him of like, I need to install all these add-ons. I need to set up all these settings and blah, blah, blah. So I think some of the complexity lies there that really to a lot of players who are in the community will say to you, like, no, you're going to have to kind of install this and this and this and this in order to even get to the point where you can play the game competently, right? When I think about our raid, for example, which is, above average raid, but it's not, we're not pushing world first or anything. Like, even us, we're like, okay, you need to have these 3 add-ons installed. You need to have these weak auras from this pack and go to this channel and put in this password and yada, 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 right? So I think there is a lot of built-in complexity, and some of it probably comes from the fact that the DNA of MMOs in a lot of ways is kind of like tabletop RPGs or like D&D or things like that. So there's a lot of stuff that's happening in chat boxes in places. There's a lot of tables of stats and stuff like that. And on top of that, I think even the way that abilities work in a lot of MMOs is it is not quite the same as a lot of action games. Like, sure, you bind things to like 1 through whatever, but in MMOs, you're often binding abilities to 1 through the equals and shift 1 through and control and alt and F and R and all these other, but like there's just lots of things going on. And as a result, there's lots of things on screen. There's lots of buffs and debuffs. There's just a lot of visual complexity. And I think when a new player who has never experienced an MMO, but has maybe played Final Fantasy 16 or like Rust or something like that, looks at those games, they just go, oh my God, like I could never understand that. And they just kind of bounce off of it. So I think our job is to kind of look at some of those more modern games, even less modern games like Minecraft, and go, what can we learn here, right? Like how could we, I ask myself often, is there a version of our game, sort of the base experience of our game, where it looks like a Final Fantasy 16, right? Where there's really not that much stuff on screen at any given time, and you can kind of focus on just the intuitive, I'm going to go up to that crab and whack it in the face, right? Or like whatever.
Right.
So, yeah, I think there is some complexity there that turns off players who have never experienced the genre, which happens to be a lot of people who are not old dudes like us, right? People who are younger, who just really never experienced the genre and think of it as kind of a boomer genre.
Sure. And Greg, you know, as much as you might dislike the idea of smacking a crab in the face, you do like the idea of it being more intuitive, though, right? Like that seems like I've heard you guys say this in multiple episodes in some form or another, even when we're not even talking about UI. This desire to not simplify the experience, but create a more intuitive front-facing experience.
Yeah, it's nice when the world just reacts the way you would expect. And Halinka shows this video in WoW, and again, we poke fun at WoW because we all worked on it, but of a new player fighting, I think, some kind of bird, and the bird is flying down and attacking him. Yeah. And any veteran WoW player would just sit there and attack the bird back. But this is a new player, so they try to run out of the way, and when they see the bird swooping, they run away. And because we've all played WoW, we know what that means is you're just going to take damage. That's a losing proposition. But logically, if a bird swooping at your face, you probably do want to duck or try to get out of the way of it. So sometimes designers use the word affordance here, which is like things kind of work the way I would expect. And MMOs are kind of famous for not doing that. It's like when you drop an item on the ground, it goes away. It doesn't like lie on the ground. It disappears. When you kill a boss, or kill any mob, it comes back in a few seconds, which is startling to you if you haven't played these kind of games before. Right.
They kind of stay on. If anything, they've got a target on you now, and there is a knowledge to that I think we take for granted. Like we'll use your simple bird thing, but a bird pecking away at me, I might be able to run away and it'll tether or whatever and go away. But not tether, leash is what I meant to say.
Oh yeah.
And but that's also a thing that you don't necessarily intuit, that if I run so far, these creatures will leave me alone and forget I exist. That's very MMO thinking, right? Like it's just not.
There's a lot of that in MMOs.
Yeah, and games in general, but MMOs have this problem of it's a big giant space where many of you are doing disparate things all at the same time and sometimes in the same proximity of one another. And so the world has to behave in a way that will work no matter what everyone else is doing. Otherwise, if this was, I don't know, Elden Ring or something, since everyone's playing that again with the DLC and stuff, that doesn't, it's not a multiplayer game in the traditional sense without a mod, but also these things react in very different ways. They will chase you forever. They will not stop until you die or jump off a cliff. Like, it's a different way of approaching it. And if there were 30 other people in that zone, it's just constant chaos 1 second to the other. So that is a challenge I guess I appreciate. I don't know if anyone's ever really truly nailed it, but I appreciate it because it's just not something players think of.
It's easy to script the messaging here. Like, we're not trying to make a game, an MMO for people who hate MMOs. Like, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to make a game for people who love MMOs. But we also recognize that the current state of MMOs are pretty old. And if you're someone out there that might love MMOs, but you kind of missed the golden era of WoW, it may be hard to onboard now. So how can we remove the barriers from people that should love these games, but have just never, had the right time to take a chance on it?
Right.
And we always include in our decks, like, shots of WoW raiding where there's a million weak auras and raid frames and stuff on the screen. And you're like, all I see is UI. Like, I don't even see the monster. I don't know what's going on here. Like, that is not the way to get your buddy who's never played MMOs before to join you.
Yeah, which kind of goes to this question we got from John Riordan on Twitter also, where he says, what is your, and we've kind of answered it. He says, what is your approach to hierarchical information? Ergo, first priority, second priority, tertiary. MMOs tend to be information overload, and this distinction and hierarchy are vital to clear communication and managing cognitive overload. Really well put, but that is kind of the challenge that we're talking about, is figuring out a way to have your screen not look like, I mean, what's the game everyone famously calls a spreadsheet? I guess EVE Online gets called that all the time.
For sure.
But I've seen plenty of WoW play where you all, I'm sure this is true of your tanking and your raid leading. Ed,
don't look at my UI.
But if you back the camera out as far as it'll go, you got a quarter of the screen doing this. You have a second screen doing something else. You know, you have all this stuff happening. You're basically playing a different game in a lot of ways. Maybe even a different game than you play when you just hop in solo to do some dailies or whatever. It's a very different, visual experience for you. And I guess there has to be some. My brain just wants to say this, and maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that's the challenge you guys have, and maybe you'll solve it. But my brain says, well, you have to have both. You have to figure out a way to give the number crunchers what they want while they're crunching their numbers, but also take that away for those who just want to walk out and go, wow, what a beautiful zone. What an amazing story I just experienced. What a cool blue zone this was. Blah, blah, blah. Like, that seems, that seems like the apple at the highest tree that nobody can reach. You think that's a fair way of describing it? Because nobody's quite nailed it yet. I'm just saying, maybe you guys are the ones. Maybe you'll figure it out. Maybe you're the ones.
It's a challenge for sure. I think there are two directions we can approach that challenge from in my mind. One of them is, what is the actual game? What is the actual game asking you to do, and what are the things that you care about, right? Like, when I think about WoW, because I know it really well, the thing I care about most of the time is, do I have all my buffs? Do I have all the right debuffs on the enemy? Am I pressing my buttons in the right order? Well, those things are true because that's how the game is designed, right? The game is designed where classes interact with lots of buffs and debuffs, and when I get this proc, I can use this thing for free, and yada, yada, yada.
Right.
That's not how combat in all games works, though, right? When you think of more action-oriented games, like Elden Ring's a great example, you're not thinking really about a lot of that stuff. You're not thinking, do I have the right buffs and debuffs? You're thinking, am I in the right spot right now? Is the enemy rearing up? Do I need to dodge at this moment? Do I need to use this key resource that I have? Things like that. So the games are just designed differently, and I think that we can leverage that to our advantage, right? If we can design the game in a way where you're relying on debuffs less, for example, and relying on some other mechanic more, then maybe we can get a lot of sort of that UI complexity down. Because the reality is, I always think about when I'm like tanking dungeons and stuff, you got 20 trash mobs and they've all got like 8 debuffs on them. That complexity adds up really fast, even if it's important. So I think you kind of have to almost change the game there to get some of that complexity down and make the game feel just more accessible, more open, more immersive, right? If you want to achieve that without losing the MMO feel.
Right.
But the other direction that you can tackle from is the direction of, when do we use UI at all? Right? Which is, I think, John's question is a great one, but it kind of starts almost from an assumption of like, okay, you have a bunch of UI, how do you organize it? My answer is like, sometimes just don't make it UI. Right. The example I gave to Greg, I think when we were talking at one point, was like, what if when you're poisoned, instead of that being a box with an icon and a wipe and a countdown on your screen that says you're poisoned and you're taking damage every 3 seconds and you hover a tooltip, what if there's green VFX on you and you're poisoned and you're taking damage, but that's all we tell you. We don't actually tell you more. That may feel a bit uncomfortable to MMO players because they want all the information all the time. And that's something we certainly have to test, but like, we have to ask ourselves questions like that, right? What are the things that we just don't surface in UI at all? And I think it extends beyond combat, right? Like, the example that I always use is like, okay, if in WoW, everything that I interact with is a UI, it's like I loot a body, it pops up a loot window. I go to craft something, I pop up the crafting menu. I open my character sheet. That's another window. My bag, it's another window. Like, we have to kind of ask ourselves, like, are there versions of any of these things that could not be UI, right?
Yeah.
Or that could only be contextual UI, like, or that could feel more immersive. I think New World does a great example, a good job of this actually, where sometimes when you talk to an NPC, like the camera will pull in, you'll turn around. It feels like the UI, even though it is a menu, is just way more integrated with the world itself, right? It doesn't feel as much like a heavy menu. It feels more like an extension of the world. Or can we project UI into the world in some cases, right? If I walk up to a building that I'm trying to complete by putting in 20 more wood, instead of popping up a thing over the entire world, could that just be a 3D billboard that's projected next to the building that says, submit 20 more wood, stuff like that? So
Sure.
I think we have to approach from both directions to kind of nail some of that complexity and manage the hierarchy. And then from there, we just prioritize, okay, what are the things that you always need? What are the things you sometimes need? What are the things you almost never need? What are the things that certain classes or certain roles need? And just give players the flexibility to tailor to
my co-host on Core, the podcast Core, we talk about all video games up and down the spectrum. He is a diehard fan of flying numbers, and it doesn't matter the game. If there are numbers flying out of it, be they damage or healing or anything, he loves it. He's a huge fan.
Yeah.
A lot of people turn him off, right? They go in there and say, I don't want to see that. I know what I'm doing. I don't need to see these things. But some kind of combination of your glowy green smoke coming off a poison dude and the option to see flying negative numbers, that seems like, this seems like the process, but this seems like maybe an answer. It's at least one possible answer to how to show these things without being so overt about sticking icons up on a screen or whatever. So Bo, if you're listening, thanks for the inspiration.
It's a great point that I think you can definitely take. UX designers tend to kind of fall somewhere on a spectrum between I know best and I'm going to design this in the way that I want you to interact with it, all the way to, hey, I'm going to give you lots of options to tailor your experience. But even that end of the spectrum that you're talking about of, okay, like maybe the player does want to be able to see the numbers or whatever, that still has to be a conscious decision, right? Is that a thing that we want a player to be able to do? Or is that something we want players to be thinking about? Is that the right experience that we want to create? And if so, then I'm kind of on that side of the spectrum where I'm like, yeah, like let's give you the option to do it, because like maybe player A doesn't care, but you do, right? Because you're the raid leader, hardcore number cruncher, spreadsheet maker, and that's okay.
Yeah, it should be okay as well. Mika in the chat room asks, how are things looking on the UI front in development right now? I know some parts of the UI. He said some of the stuff was shown during the latest blog post, but has anything changed since then? Any new icons, that sort of thing? I mean, obviously what you guys showed in that initial blog post, super rudimentary, basic, let's get going. We want to, that and you were very open about all that, right? This was the whole point of that post. But can you say anything about where we're at right now? Has any of the sort of art direction from any of your amazing, talented leads in the team, has any of that bled into the process yet? Any major developments, I guess, that you can talk about?
For the most part, I would say no, and I can talk about my philosophy around UX at this stage of a game. I think really we're trying to figure out elements of our direction. We've talked about some of it, right? Should we have add-ons, for example, and how should they work? Or how should our camera behave in our game? Because those are fundamental things that are going to affect every aspect of our design forever. But the reality is there are a lot of things that don't. Like how I display your health on screen, we could kind of solve that problem anytime, and it's not going to, fundamentally change what our game is. And so with a lot of our core UI elements, like our HUD and stuff, my mentality oftentimes is, how do I just make sure that our game designers, our engineers, etc., are able to test and play test the things that we care about in other aspects of the game, right? So seeing your party's health on screen in some way, shape, or form is really important, because we are testing party functionality and grouping and whatever. But does it exactly matter if that's as robust as WoW's raid frames, or if positioning them in this way or that way, or making them squares or rectangles is the best thing? I'm not caring too much about that right now. probably once we kind of push into pre-production is when we'll start to think about, okay, what's the art direction for our UI, for example, like what's the metaphor in general for the UI? How does it look and feel? Where are the elements placed? How do they stack? How do they move around each other, or things like that? So we'll start to tackle a lot of that maybe next year, but for now it's mostly just how do we get something so that we can unblock all the great people who are doing awesome stuff in the game.
So from what we saw in that blog post, Greg, till now, is there anything in there that you see as I don't know, something that's changed majorly that if people saw it now, they'd go, oh, it's no longer the metal dude from UI or Unreal Engine's freaking library of metal guys or whatever.
We're shipping with him.
Still a metal guy. We have a 3D artist now who is making 3D models, but before you could put 3D models in the game, you also need an animator.
Yeah.
You can't just like get animations off the store the way you can whole characters. So that's the barrier there. The biggest difference people would notice is the blue zones have a lot more content in them now. Like as you're running around, you encounter a lot of novel situations and there are objectives, but you can't just like charge the objective and do it immediately. They're usually intermediary steps, and we're kind of experimenting with how much do we put that in front of players versus how much the experiment. I mean, blue zones are really the major innovation that we're bringing to the game. So we're focused a lot right now on making sure we can deliver on that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of the blue zone thing I think I saw they were making progress on was like the sort of blue zone completion, like reward, ceremony or whatever. So, which we think is really important because we know some players may want to keep around, oh, this is the blue zone that me and my friends are building our base or whatever. But like a lot of them, we kind of project you're going to like go do them for a few hours or a day or something, complete it and get some rewards and turn it in. And so we're kind of testing what that experience could look like too, in terms of objectives and rewards and that kind of stuff. And it's early days for sure, but we're experimenting with that.
That brings up a big, really important question in my head. I think one of the most important things, or one of the things that Blizzard did really well and kind of established as a norm, and then everybody kind of picked up on it. Mm-hmm. And not just with WoW, but like Hearthstone and even Diablo is a good example. Diablo 3 in particular, because 4 kind of does the same thing. But big poppin' moments of dopamine generating excitement from a cool thing you did. So whether it's cling, the sound of a sword hitting the ground, and it's orange, and it's orange and legendary. Why? Because there's a pillar of light from heaven shining on the thing. I mean, it's so satisfying compared to just like something dropped. I guess I got to go look and see what it is. Oh, it's good. I guess I'll wear that. I mean, there's not a place for that. I think there are places for that, but MMOs, especially when you ding or you accomplish something big, or when a boss dies, whether you augment it with some sort of in-engine cinematic or even out-of-engine cinematic or whatever it is. Yeah. I guess how important at this stage, it's early, but at this stage, are you guys looking to just pop when people, pull off the big deals?
You want to talk about it, Greg?
Yeah, what do you think, Greg?
It is important. We were just talking about Elden Ring, and imagine how that game, even though they don't do a lot of UI, when you beat a boss, it pops up "boss defeated" in giant letters to make you feel awesome. Like, it's an accomplishment, and that celebration matters. And so we do want to focus on that, particularly for blue zones. We want players to finish a blue zone objective. We want them to kind of feel like a mission's accomplished, they can move on. Behind the scenes, we can't afford to have players generate thousands of these blue zones, then just like store them off forever, because that is storage that we pay for. So we want to motivate players to finish a blue zone and be like, okay, I don't need to come back here. I've done everything I wanted to do. Now, that said, if there's a blue zone they love and they want this to be like their forever home, and that's fine if they can keep a couple of them like that active forever. But mostly, in the same way with a WoW dungeon, you kind of want to finish the boss and get out. You don't want to just hang out there forever.
Right. The difference is these are more unique to each. Every player is going to be unique in this case, or every blue zone could be unique in this case, right? Or at least that's what we've talked about before. So in theory, I guess this is a whole different episode, but if every player, let's say 1 million people signed up on the first day, and all 1 million people are like, I'm keeping this first zone to remember my first blue zone. And so it's there forever. I mean, did that buy you a new data center? Like, what happened if that happens? It seems bad.
Yeah, that probably just buys us a new data center. We have to be smart about the way we do that. Like, it might be okay to pass that cost along to players to say, like, oh, do you want to keep more blue zones open? That's fine. Can you just give us a couple bucks to do that? That won't be a major revenue source for us, but it'll, help us pay for something that players are saying they want to keep.
Yeah, that makes sense. Go ahead, Ed. You were going to say. Yeah.
There's one more thing that I think is interesting to talk about celebration and rewards, which this is a whole like discipline that I'm not qualified to really talk about. So bear with me. But like, players like the celebration. I think Greg talked about, I defeated the boss. Like there's this big moment, or like the legendary item drop. Like it's this big moment. The sound effects, the VFX, the beam from the sky, whatever. These are all really cool. I think what is challenging is we've probably all seen or experienced a game where like that's all there was in the game. Where the developer tried to make sort of everything is just, oh, this is amazing and that's amazing and it's like, but you end up feeling like, okay, none of this actually matters, right? Because the actual like texture, the highs and lows to the experience is important in doing rewards design and in doing game flow, right? You want to feel like, okay, I went into this blue zone. Yeah, I picked up a couple little rewards here and there. I opened this chest, yada, yada, yada. I killed this little mini boss and that actually dropped a really important crafting item that I need. That felt really good. Then I complete the blue zone and it's just like the pinnacle of excitement, right? It's like, I got a huge reward from that. It's really going to advance my progress in some way. I'm going to show my friend this cool legendary item that I got, whatever it might be. But I think that the important takeaway there that might be obvious to a lot of people, but is worth saying is, if every reward is trying to be super over the top, give you tons of power, yada, 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 that it all equalizes out. It all ends up just kind of feeling like nothing. And likewise, if all the rewards are just these little incremental dinky +1 strength or whatever, it also feels like that, right? So it's a challenge to find the right balance of small rewards, medium, large rewards, and sprinkling them in the right places in the experience to really make it feel like you're kind of accomplishing something worthwhile. And that there is some like, there's a flow to that matters a lot.
Right. That actually is a really good lead into this question here. Might be our final one. This is also from Mika in the chat. By the way, not a dude. I think I said he earlier. Sorry about that. She says, no, you guys have touched on this subject before, but how will the transition between menus /blue zones /red zones, etc. work? Will it be a static thing or a more dynamic thing, entering a portal then exiting? I think this is a great question because it goes to that flourish and also just to the need to zone somewhere. Greg, let's start with you. Do you want people to go through a cool transition, like a portal or something super dramatic?
He hates cool transitions.
He hates them. He's the worst.
I think our whole game doesn't work if what it feels like to players is bringing up a server list of like, do you want to go to blue zone 34652/Z? Or, I mean, that's kind of what MMOs traditionally do. We want to make it much more in world, particularly this moment. It should feel like I'm going, if this is not a sci-fi game, but if it was a sci-fi game, it would be, I'm like about to land on an alien world, and you want that to be exciting and you want that to be in your face and not just pick from a list. So we probably need on the back end some kind of transition while we're spinning up the world. We've talked about things like, the Indiana Jones red line that shows you going across a map, or even the way World of Warcraft, I know in Shadowlands, as you were pulling in a new zone, they would show your space worm or whatever kind of flying through space, and then the new zone would come in.
Right.
So we'll need some kind of transition that isn't just a loading bar or here's a happy, helpful tips. Be nice to people and they'll join your party again in the future.
Yeah.
We want it to feel in world. And we have some ideas here of like how you find a new blue shard and how you create the portal that goes to it. But at the same time, we also need, like, I want to call up an old one that I've gone to before, or I want to go into, like, Ed made a cool one. He's asking me to join him. I need to be able to find Ed's map and jump into that game as well. But at the same time, we don't, this isn't a game about, like, charting your course and flying through space to different planets. So we have to kind of hand wave past that.
Are you excited, Ed, to bump heads with people like Blake or anyone else on the team in charge of engineering stuff and go, yeah, we really want this to look like this, and they're like, oh, you know what I mean?
Every time I talk to engineers, they talk to me like that.
I feel like this has got to be a thing. I mean, I bring it up a lot, so maybe it's only a thing in my head, but it's like tech support and sales. They have to figure out a way to make whatever the middle is work, and I suppose you've had some experience with that.
I think honestly, my honest answer, which is I guess maybe not super exciting, is anytime most engineers that I have ever worked with approach things from the perspective of like, yeah, we can do anything. Like, let's figure it out. It's just a question of cost and time, right? And I think that's true of our engineers too. They're fantastic and awesome to partner with. And I'm not just saying that, except Blake, that guy sucks. No, I'm kidding. But no, I think actually experiences like Greg is talking about. There's two factors. One is how expensive is it for us to build maybe the ideal experience we want, and then also there is an aspect of it that is like, how creative can we get? Because maybe, for example, we want it to feel like, as Greg said, you're seamlessly traveling on a ship between this location and that location, or whatever. But we can fake a lot of things, right? I remember this mobile game that I played. I don't even remember what game it was anymore, but it was really, once you finished, it was like a MOBA or something of that nature. And once you finished the sort of matchmaking and hero selection process, it would be like you were kind of being sucked into this portal, and it was kind of this dynamically generated, like you're whirling around and you'd see the other characters kind of flying through space with you, and then you would kind of land on the battlefield on the map. And I'm sure all that was faked. I'm sure that like we weren't literally flying through a portal, and my friends weren't literally there, but like it made it look like it was, even though what was probably happening behind the scenes was the server is spinning up that map and loading all the stuff, and then as soon as it's loaded, it plops us in instantly, right? So sure. I think we have to be creative, right? Maybe literally making you fly from location to A to B is impossible, or would make the engineers die a little inside. But like faking it as if that's what's happening, I think is very possible in a lot of cases. And the way that I've encouraged the team to think about user experience design for our game is really hierarchical. It's default to what does it look like if we don't have a UI to do this thing, right? So it isn't I go up to the NPC and I talk to them and I select from the drop down the blue zone I want to go to. Maybe it is more like I go through this portal, or I step onto this ship, or I go into this wind tunnel, or whatever. And then if that doesn't work, right, what is the hybrid approach? Like I was kind of alluding to earlier, what's the thing that's sort of projected in world that gives you more information that you need, but isn't a piece of UI that feels super heavy? And if that doesn't work too, maybe then it's time to like use UI to solve that problem.
Right.
But I think like inverting that pyramid a little bit, and like not going to UI as the sort of hammer, the proverbial hammer, I think is like the right way to look at it. Because if we do look at every problem through the lens of how do we make a menu to solve this, we'll end up with a game that's all menus, right? That's just the way that it goes.
Just got to find your Nathan Drake crevice, whatever that is, exactly. The thing to hide the load and make it seem like Nathan's stuck somewhere tight and he has to work his way through. But meanwhile, the whole level was loaded while he was getting through there.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure you guys will find it. Well, this has been incredibly interesting conversation. If anyone out there is like, man, I have so much to ask and say about on this subject of UX or UI or any of this user experience stuff, please text us or voicemail us at 801-471-0462 with any questions you might have about Ghost and its current development and where we're at. We'll have an episode 9 in July, of course, as well, talking more with more people at the company. Of course, Greg will be back. Ed, it was a pleasure having you on, man. Thank you so much for,
it was awesome
being here. Yeah, and if you ever need to recruit any extra people for your hardcore raids, well, I don't do those anymore, so don't walk into me. Just kidding. Greg, anything you'd like to say before we go, sir?
I love talking about the game. It's so much fun to come out here and talk about stuff where we're like, yeah, we have a pretty good idea, or like, yeah, we have no idea. We're gonna solve it at some point.
Yeah,
it's fun to see what people are interested in. The questions and concerns that come out of chat, and and Twitter and other things. So, I want to thank everyone for being on this journey with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, really appreciate it. You guys are awesome. The show doesn't exist without you, so please keep coming and checking us out each time we do it live. And, of course, the podcast and everything available at frogpants.com/street. You can find archival videos of this at various links, fantasticpixelcastle.com, of course, for all things Ghost. You'll find links there, as well as the Frog Pants link. And big thanks in the behind-the-scenes stuff goes out to John and Faye, as always, for being amazing and helping this all happen the way that it does. That is going to do it for us. Thank you all for listening. Come back next month for another one. We'll let you know ahead of time so you can ask your questions and all that. We'll see you then.
This show is part of the Frog Pants Network. Yes. Get more at frogpants.com.
And we did it.